One of the primary problems for Judeo-Christian theologians is the disturbing reality that both King David and King Solomon, the most celebrated kings of Judaic history, cannot be found in the historical record. How can this be? How could the wealthy and influential empires suddenly disappear from the archaeological record? Historian Ralph Ellis, author of Jesus, The Last of the Pharaohs, and other intriguing books, says that the lack of evidence may simply be a matter of looking in the wrong place. His research into ancient texts through the science of etymology has led him to some original conclusions. Perhaps the most startling is that the Judaic culture may have stemmed from the Hyksos line of Egyptian pharaohs. To understand the genesis of all of this incredible work you've done, we really have to understand that it's all, from ancient times until now, is a matter of interpretation, and a deep understanding of etymology is important to all of this, as you have taken it upon yourself to learn ancient Egyptian and Hebrew to the extent you know a lot of the words and can do some of your own interpretation quite easily. And it starts putting a different spin to the story. And speaking of spins to the story, can you set us up with an understanding of what the pessure technique is? And then we're going to get into the juicy stuff.
Okay, well, the pessure technique is just the interpretation of the text, assuming effectively that most of the texts are written as parables, and so there are deeper meanings within the text. I think sometimes it's easy to see too much into these texts, and so you have to be very careful about how deeply you take it. And I think some of the books that have been written have taken the pessure technique rather too far. Mm-hmm. But I do use a sort of similar technique in that I'm retranslating, effectively, what the texts are actually saying. So, just for an example, in the Bible, it talks about Abraham having 318 servants, which might sound unusual because he was supposed to be a shepherd. You know, why would a shepherd have 318 servants? But if you look into Josephus, and I use Josephus or Josephus as they tend to say in America, if you look into his version of the same text, he clearly says that Abraham had 318 army officers. So a very small change, but then makes a very big change in the understanding of that particular text. What it means, of course, is that Abraham had an army of about 30,000 people. So he must have been very influential, very powerful. He must have been a king. But
if you're reading the most common versions of the Bible today, you would come away thinking that all of these great characters throughout biblical history in particular are basically shepherds.
Yes.
And it's a very pastoral, idyllic, moral kind of scenario
very much so.
That they're passing on through these writings. And in fact, what you're relaying is something much richer, because you're saying, why is it that some of these most well-known people throughout the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and the Islamic faith all have the same stories, essentially have the same root to the same names, if they were shepherds?
Yes.
Instead of powerful people of the day, why can't you find them as biblical characters throughout history? So let's launch right in. Let's talk about Abraham.
Yes. Well, there you come to one of the nubs of the whole story. They were called, in the Bible, as we know, shepherds. Why were they called shepherds? Well, the reason, I believe, is because they were the shepherd kings. And there was a line of pharaohs within Egypt who are known as the Hyksos, or the Hyksos, who were known as the shepherd kings. And that is where the term shepherd comes from. And so Abraham was not a shepherd. He had 318 army officers.
Meaning a vast army.
A vast army of at least 30,000 people. So he was a shepherd king. And we know who the shepherd kings were. They were the Hyksos. And they were the people who controlled Lower Egypt. That's the northern half of Egypt. Egypt was quite traditionally, it was divided between north and south quite on a number of occasions. It wasn't always united. And so you had a southern pharaoh and a northern pharaoh. And during the Hyksos period, again we had two pharaohs. and we had this line of shepherd kings in the north, and this is where I think the story comes from. And this is a presumption that goes back a long way. If you read Josephus and his history, now Josephus was around the 1st century AD, and he wrote a history of the Israelites, and he actually said that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Lower Egypt. Mm-hmm. No one really took up on his assertion there. It seems to have been forgotten somewhere. However, if we take what he said as being true, everything in the Bible suddenly starts to make more sense.
Right, most definitely. And could it have been conveniently forgotten for political reasons?
I think so. I've thought long and hard about why this should have been done. But I think the change happened somewhere perhaps during the Babylonian exile. Obviously, Israel had been destroyed, the people had been scattered, they were now in exile in Babylon, and I think they were looking maybe for a scapegoat. And there is a section in the Bible which accuses Egypt of being the root of all evil. And I think at that point there was a separation made between the original Egyptian history and what became the normal biblical history, saying it all occurred sort of in Judea, mostly anyway. And so there was, they needed someone to blame, effectively, and so they adopted the sort of victim status in order to keep the people together and forge this new effective religion. And that became the Judaism that we know today.
Which essentially became what the Old Testament was based on.
Yes, but effectively it was a true history of something that was completely different. And so we have to look back through the text and sort of reinterpret the text, trying to see the original Egyptian historical evidence. Because the Bible as we see it has somehow become divorced totally from history. So here we have a book that is a complete history of these people, and yet nothing, none of these events, none of these people, nothing within the Bible can be found within the historical record.
Right, which is really
which is
quite
very
intriguing,
strange.
Yes.
It's as though the Bible happened on a different planet.
Right.
But it didn't. We know where it happened, roughly. So, and these people were important, whether it was Abraham, whether it was King David and King Solomon, who were supposed to be the most influential monarchs in that area, in that era, and yet they can't be found in the historical record. And so the question is, why?
And this is where the etymology comes into play.
Indeed.
So can you start giving us some, maybe a little bit more specific idea of what you're talking about in terms of who these players throughout biblical history may have been in secular history?
Yes, well, let's look at the United Monarchy, for instance. That's King David and King Solomon. As I said, they were hugely influential, very wealthy. Monarchs came from all over the region to pay them tribute. And yet they are missing in the historical record. They've done a lot of archaeology in Judea, in Jerusalem. And the conclusion of Finkelstein, who's one of the eminent archaeologists of that area, is that Jerusalem was no more than a village during this era. And of course he's found no evidence for King David and King Solomon, which is a bit of a problem. Because here we have this story about these famous kings, and they are not there. And so you've only got two options, really. Either, as some people maintain, it's all mythology, and this book was completely made up, or we're looking in the wrong location.
Which is interesting, because a lot of people have become disenfranchised with their religion, and
Yes.
certainly on fundamental levels have
Yes.
basically, I think what you're saying is thrown the baby out with the bathwater, that there's an incredibly rich story embedded there if you know how to read it.
Yes. There are two problems here. The Israelites have taken back Israel, of course, and they sent out their archaeologists into the field and said, right, you know, we now have the opportunity, go and look for the evidence. And they can't find it. And so, yes, that is a big problem for Judaism. So anyway, they cannot find these two influential monarchs in the historical record. So the alternative, the obvious alternative, was to look elsewhere for these monarchs. Maybe they were looking in the wrong location. Maybe the history is there, but they are looking in the wrong location.
Quite literally.
Yes, indeed. So they're looking in Jerusalem. Perhaps their main city, their capital city, was not based in Jerusalem. Maybe it was elsewhere.
This has a lot of implications when you have all this fighting going on over the Temple
Indeed,
Mount, for
yes,
example. But we'll talk about that later.
Yes, it becomes very political. So anyway, I started looking, having already looked at the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, having already realized that it was quite possible that the early Israelites were the Hyksos. And a critical piece of that evidence was the Exodus. Now, we all know the Exodus from the biblical story, and we've all been through standard education for Christianity, maybe Sunday school, etc. But never is it told to us that there was an identical Exodus out of Egypt by the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. There was a civil war, and so these kings, who are known as shepherds, who were circumcised, who had earrings, who wore curly side locks of hair, of course,
right,
standard Egyptian custom. They had this civil war with the southern Egyptians. At the same time, there was storms, darkness, and possibly plagues. And they were kicked out of Egypt. They started from Pi Ramesses in northern Egypt, and about 500,000 people went on an exodus to Jerusalem.
Sounding very familiar from my
Sunday
Sunday school classes.
This is not biblical history, this is real history. This
Right.
comes from the texts of Egypt, it comes from Manetho and some of the other texts, like the destruction of mankind and other ancient Egyptian texts. And so this Exodus account from history is almost identical to the biblical Exodus. The only thing it differs in is the date, which is about 300 years before the accepted era for the biblical Exodus. However, we have an identical situation. And so it seemed likely to me that the early Israelites were linked very strongly with the northern Egyptian Hyksos line. And so if we want to look at later Israelite history, then perhaps somehow that is also related to the Egyptian line.
Let's bring in, again, some of the evidence based on etymology. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to the Exodus, or Israel and the Exodus, and Moses and his role, and
Yes.
who Moses was, as a matter of what you have been discovering. You found something entirely different.
Yes, now it does get a little bit complicated because it's clear from the historical record that there were two exoduses, not
Right.
one. And Manetho being an Egyptian historian of about 300 BC, so he was rather closer to this era than we are. And he said there were two exoduses. There was the big exodus that we've just talked about, which was the Hyksos exodus out of Egypt. And then he talks about a smaller exodus of maimed priests and lepers, 80,000 of them. Now these 80,000 maimed priests and lepers had been exiled into Middle Egypt on the east bank of the Nile to a stone quarry. And I think in this we can see a history of the founding of Amarna, which was the new city of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the rebel pharaoh.
Right.
And so his new city would have been a quarry because they had to construct it from nothing. Manetho then goes on to say that these people were eventually pushed out of this area on the east bank of the Nile. And they went to Avaris, which is up in the Nile Delta, which is Pi Ramesses, of course, same town. And so within this, I think we can see a story about the abandonment of Amarna, because we know that Akhenaten went to Amarna, and about 12 years later, his whole empire collapsed. And we don't know what happened to him, his royal family, Nefertiti, Kia, his other wife. All of the main players are not present. People say they died at Amarna, but there is no evidence for that. But Manetho seems to be clearly stating that they actually went on another exodus, a smaller exodus, up to Avaris, and then maybe beyond. Now, the strange thing is, the brother of Akhenaten was called Moses, Tuthmosis. And so we seem to have the two brothers. In the Bible, they're called Aaron and Moses, and in history, they were called Akhenaten and Tuthmosis. And here, I think, is where we bring in the story about Moses and his part in the Exodus. And what's happened in the Bible, of course, is they've taken these two Exodus events and they've combined them into one story, effectively. But I think it was two exoduses, as Manetho states. And both of these exoduses, of course, went up to the north because eventually these maimed priests and lepers were kicked out of Avaris as well.
And what do you think the maimed priests and lepers, 80,000
well,
of them,
this
you said?
80,000 maimed
actually
priests.
were?
Well, Akhenaten, as we know, was the rebel pharaoh. So he was the pharaoh who tried to institute monotheism
Right.
within Egypt. So he was destroying the old gods and instituting his new god, the Aten. And of course, the biblical god is sometimes called the Adon. And so Aten is the same god, obviously. Now, from the Theban priesthood's perspective, this would have been very heretical. And so Akhenaten would have been called the maimed priest and a leper. Not a real leper,
Meaning
of
an
course.
outcast.
An outcast, a theological leper, because his new sect was so different and so confrontational that it was destroying all the old traditions, all the old gods. And so, yes, of course, he would be called the maimed priest and the theological
So
leper.
this would have been a group of religious rebels, essentially.
Yes, effectively.
Effectively led by him.
Yes, which it was, and we know that from history. And of course, from the biblical perspective, we have the same story, because Moses was doing exactly the same thing. He was the monotheist, he was in Egypt, he was of the royal family, of course, he was known as a prince of Egypt. And if you read Josephus, of course, Moses was also an army commander. He was the chief army commander within Egypt, who led the battle against the Ethiopians. So he was a very important character within Egyptian society. And likewise, he was connected with monotheism and a clash with the establishment within Egypt. So again, it's the same story.
And this, again, going back to the root of a lot of the explanations in the simple pastoral way, I read a couple of verses that you had quoted from the Bible, talking about where Jesus had said, this knowledge is for essentially, this knowledge is not for all.
Yes.
This knowledge that we pass among ourselves, the initiates, is for the few. The other knowledge is passed to the people,
This is why
the
Jesus
lay person.
always spoke in parables, because the Church of Jesus was based on initiation, of course. There were many levels within his church. And the disciples, and even within the disciples, there were many levels. And so we had various initiations into this church. The laity knew nothing, and they just had the outer layer of the parable.
Which is essentially what we have today.
Yes.
To a large extent in the Bible.
I'm thinking more of a sort of Masonic type initiation.
Right, no, I was saying the laity part, the Bible that's passed on to us through
Yes.
Sunday school and sermons, by and large, is the pastoral.
Yes.
Simple
Very much
version
so.
of it. However, as many books have come out talking about the lost years of Jesus and Jesus' pilgrimage into Egypt and having learned a lot of the ancient mysteries, this is being well documented now. So let's pick it up from there. Who Jesus, we'll go into that part of the story later on, but again, the whole notion of the need to separate out the information because of that elite knowledge.
Yes. And not only elite knowledge, of course, and I think they did have some very interesting knowledge, but also the true history, which they would have known,
Right.
which again the laity did not. And so again we have this differentiation between...
And it keeps people very simple
very much
in
so.
their union.
Yes.
Us against them.
Yes. And it says very clearly, I can't remember the exact quote, but there was a quote from Jesus within the Bible that says most clearly, this is not a subject to be given to the common people. This is just...
That's the one I was referring to,
that's
exactly.
Right. This is just for you, the disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And then even amongst the disciples, he says, well, you know, why can't you understand?
And if you go back into Egyptology, you're talking, and this again is sprinkled throughout the Bible even. If you go back into Egyptology, for example, there was a much greater understanding of the human condition, and as we relate to the cosmos, and cartography was much better developed at that time. All of these ancient knowledges, which are just now coming back to light, played prominently and then showed up in the Bible, as I think there was something about mating between the cows. Was it mating between the cows and the...
Oh, yes, from the Old Testament,
yes.
the cows and the sheep.
Sheep, yes.
We have this wonderful story from the Bible, and this is what I like about my research. A lot of the Bible doesn't make any sense. You read it and you think, you know, these guys...
Mating between cows and sheep?
Yeah, these guys must have been on something, you know, to write all this. You know, what is it on about? But when you can look at the text from the right perspective, it actually begins to make sense. And effectively, all this talk about cows and sheep was all astrology. It
right,
was all to do
which the Egyptians were noted for.
Of course. Now, a lot of people will say that the zodiac does not go back that far. You know, it's Greek, it doesn't go back. But it seems quite clear from the writings of Josephus that it did, because he plainly states that the loaves on the altar, the 12 loaves, represented the 12 constellations. The buttons on the priest's tunic represented the constellations, etc., and the 7 planets. The menorah represented the 7 planets, etc. And of course, he's talking about the era of Moses again and Joseph, which in normal terms must be around sort of 1500 BC.
BC, right.
So, you know, Josephus is saying quite clearly that the knowledge of the zodiac goes back at least that far.
So I only bring that up to say that this is just one example of how the Bible and how other texts, the Torah, the Old Testament, would you say the Quran as well, can be read again on these dual
absolutely.
levels,
Very much so.
embedded with the same characters?
Very much so. A typical one is Jesus, of course. Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but he became a fisher of men. Why? Well, because under precession, the earth rotates...
Precession of the equinox, which we have covered also.
Indeed, yes. It rotates around into the different houses of the different parts of the constellation. And at the turn of the 1st century, of course, we changed from Aries into Pisces.
Right.
And so Jesus was born as a lamb, but became a fisherman.
Right.
And so again, we see this covert reference to the zodiac all the time. But of course, most of this was destroyed. And that's another reason why it became covered up. It wasn't just simply that this was an initiation into the church, but we also ended up with 2 churches during the time of Jesus. We had the Church of Jesus and James, but then there was a split, of course, and Saul, or St. Paul, went off and did his own thing. Now, Saul had been the enemy of Jesus, and so they were very cautious about this guy. They didn't trust him. So Saul had never really been initiated into the full meaning of the Church of Jesus and James. So when he went off and started his own church, he didn't know all the secrets.
And this is where a lot of the Christian doctrine came from,
Well,
right?
Yeah, Christianity has nothing to do with the Church of Jesus and James.
Right.
It is the Church of Saul.
Right.
It's the splinter group. So we had this big confrontation between the Church of James and the Church of Saul. Now, the Church of Jesus and James, of course, was Jewish. It was a Jewish sect.
Right.
You had to be circumcised. You had to follow the Mosaic law, etc. All of the normal things you would find within Judaism. It's more of a way of life, etc., than a straight religion. Saul, on the other hand, went off and he wanted to found a popularist church. So he went off and said, right, okay, I'm not only going to preach to the Jews, but we'll preach to the Gentiles as well, because there's more Gentiles than Jews, and I want to be a successful church. So he went off and started preaching to Gentiles, and he scrapped all of Mosaic law and just had the Ten Commandments. And then we had this big discussion about circumcision, of course, which you had to be circumcised, obviously, within the Church of Jesus. And Saul went off and he started not only accepting people who weren't circumcised, he actually said, well, if circumcision means that much to the Jews, why don't they just cut their penis off and have done with it? And that's in Acts. No,
Yes.
it's in
Rather denigrating statement.
Galatians, yes. And so we can see this big separation between the original church of Jesus and the new church of Saul. And it was the church of Saul, of course, that became dominant. It was much more commercial. It was more like, perhaps some of these televangelists that you see on American television. He was after there for the money. And he became the dominant church in that region. And the Church of Jesus and James sunk into obscurity.
So in essence, then, the texts that happen in the New Testament base of work, essentially became also included in the King James Version. Is that fair to say? Is this all rooted back to the Church of Saul?
Yes, all of it. Now, he did pick out, obviously, some areas from the Church of Jesus and James, of course. But most of what he picked out, of course, had nothing to do with the original church. And this is why we see this big difference. And so within the Church of Saul, which became Christianity, of course, we don't see any reference to the zodiac. Astrology became banned, effectively.
Right.
We don't see the role of women because Saul was the original misogynist, basically.
Right, and that's reflected in the Bible.
Very much so.
Mothers are whores, that's kind of where women ended up.
Women must be seen and not heard and all this sort of business. Whereas we know from the few texts we do have about the Church of Jesus and James that Mary Magdalene, of course, was the senior disciple.
That's right.
And hence we have this slightly new discussion, but it is an old discussion about whether Mary Magdalene was in the Last Supper scene.
Right, and we're going to get into that, the whole lineage of Jesus. Actually, we're going to separate that out into a second interview, so we'll keep people on the line a bit here, won't we? But not intentionally, it's just that there's so much more to cover here,
Indeed, yes.
based out of the Old Testament. So if you can continue on what you were saying, and then also let's get into the temple at Jerusalem. I don't know if it's a non sequitur and we should just jump there right now, but what would you prefer?
Yes. Well, yes. Let's go back to the building of the Temple of Jerusalem. So that's going back to the United Monarchy era of David and King Solomon. As we were saying before, they can't be found in the historical record, so where were they? And having spoken so much about Egypt, well, let's look at them from the Egyptian perspective. And obviously we're not going to find those names within the historical record, because otherwise they would have been found already.
Right.
People would have known about them. So what we're looking for is a couple of attributes that are central to the United Monarchy story. And that is King David, who was known as, well, he was primarily known for the city and the star. The city of David and the Star of David. And these are two very, very important shibboleths of his reign. And so what we're looking for is something similar within the Egyptian record. And of course, if we look in exactly the same era as King David, we find a pharaoh from Lower Egypt, again, the Hyksos, who was known for the city and the star. And his name was Pasiba Kahainut, or Susannes in the Greek version. And his name actually has the city glyph and the star glyph. And that was my starting point.
And that's interesting because when you look at the Star of David and you look at the star tetrahedron embedded in all throughout Egyptology, it's the same star.
Yes. Well, they had two stars in Egypt, of course. Most of them were the pentagon star. Most of them were five-sided stars. The Star of David, of course, is two pyramids.
Right, the star tetrahedron,
Yeah.
which is in a lot of the mysticism of Egypt.
Indeed, yes. It's simply two pyramids
Right.
superimposed on each other.
Right.
And that's important because that's where the symbology came from. It came from Giza, it came from the pyramids. But here we have a monarch who has the same attributes as King David. And so I just started idly looking at this monarch and seeing if anything else compares. Because obviously if King David, what I'm saying here, and it's a big jump of course, is that King David was this pharaoh called Susans.
Mm-hmm.
But if he was, then everything else around him within the united monarchy, you know, his ancestors, his descendants, his courtiers, everything should be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Now you might think that is impossible, that everything from the court of King David could be the same as the court of this particular pharaoh. But it's not. It's exactly the same. So he has the same ancestors, he has the same descendants, he has the same daughter, the same army commander, the same architect. So let's have a look at a few of those. One of the ancestors of King David, of course, was Salmon, and the direct ancestor of Susans was called Siamun. Siamun,
Mm-hmm.
Salmon.
Mm-hmm.
His daughter, the daughter of King David, was called Machatamar. And if we look into the historical record, the daughter of this particular pharaoh was called Makara Mutemhat.
Mm-hmm.
Makatema, Makara Mutemhat.
Mm-hmm.
His army commander for King David was called Joab. And the army commander of this particular pharaoh was called Joab Njed. Joab.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see all these links coming together where everything fits together. So it's not just a shot in the dark that, you know, this monarch is around at the same time as King David, and perhaps he could be associated with stars and cities. It's his entire court seems to be identical to the court of King David. And so I made this radical proposal that he was King David. And so many things began to fit together, it was untrue. And one of the central points was, where was his court located? So where was his capital city? Was it in Jerusalem? Because these pharaohs actually did start later on in the next reign to control all of Judea as well. So they were influential in Judea as well as Lower Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So where was the capital city? Well, it just so happens that the original names for Jerusalem were Zoan and Jebus. Those were the original names of Jerusalem. And it's from there, of course, that we get the Zionists, of course, from Zion.
Mm-hmm.
As it happens, the city of Tanis in Egypt was called Zoan. Zoan, Zion.
And that's near Port Said.
Yes, it's up in the northeast delta.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also called Chebet.
Mm-hmm.
Jebet, Jebus. So even the city has the same names as are used for Jerusalem. And so this proposal becomes even more radical, because what I'm saying here is that not only was this monarch actually a Lower Egyptian monarch, but the city was actually located, the capital city was located in the Nile Delta at Tanis. And so, okay, it's a big radical change to the story, but actually, in some senses, it's not. All I'm saying is, it wasn't there; it was here. So all we're doing is changing the location, and suddenly, everything within the Bible at that point in time, the United Monarchy, starts to make sense.
Right, because you also talk about references where in the Bible it specifically, in the Torah also, where it specifically refers to going in a particular direction to get supplies, for example.
Yes.
And those directions would line up with the coming from Zoan, as you say, or Tennis, as you say, rather than Jerusalem in some cases.
Yes, they had lots of mentions of going down into Egypt,
Right.
which would seem to separate the biblical story from Egypt.
Right, or
But-
going south, either one, yeah.
But within the ancient texts, the Egyptian texts, they had the same terminology. And even within Josephus, they have the same terminology. And they go from the Nile Delta down into Egypt.
Right.
So Egypt, obviously, in that era, was really a reference to Upper Egypt,
Right.
to Thebes.
Right.
It didn't really refer to the entire area that we would know as Egypt today. And so, yes, these stories about people going down into Egypt still make sense, even if you locate Jerusalem in Tanis.
In Tennis. So, if we can get to this for a second, what is in Jerusalem supposedly under the Temple Mount then?
Well, there's nothing. This is the problem. They can't find anything that can show that the Temple of Solomon was actually there. And so we have a big gap in the archaeology. They can't find David and Solomon's palace. They can't find his temple. They can't find any major city within Jerusalem at that time. This is the Jerusalem, obviously, in Israel.
Because it was, as you say, a village.
Because
it wasn't a thriving metropolis.
It was only a village in that era. But of course, if you come back into Tanis, of course, this was a major metropolis, and it had not just one temple; it had several temples, and most marvelous architecture, huge, great pillars, granite pillars made in the shape of palm trees, actually beautifully carved, fantastic pieces of workmanship. And of course, the temple there has the same name as the temple in Jerusalem. Again, you know, everything just starts, you just have to read the book and everything fits together. It's amazing. The Temple of Jerusalem was known as the Hyksos Yahweh, the Temple of Yahweh. And the temple in Tanis was known as the Hetkar Ptah, the Temple of Ptah. Hyksos Hetkar. It has the same prefix. And so, yes, I think we will find eventually that the Temple of Jerusalem was actually in Tanis. It was one of the Tanis temples, either the main temple or perhaps the new, smaller temple which was built on the back.
So needless to say, this has very large implications as to what's going on in modern times.
It does. It means the Zionists are looking in the wrong place for the homeland. You know, the original homeland was Zoan, not Zion. It was Tanis, the Nile Delta, because the Israelites were the Lower Egyptians, the Hyksos or the Hyksos, Egyptians from Lower Egypt, and that was their original homeland. So yes, it's very contentious, but it makes sense, and it makes much more sense than throwing out the Bible and saying, you know, it's just mythology. You know, if you think about it, here we've got the entire history of this region, whether it be Egypt or Israel, that goes back at least sort of 2000 BC. Now, if someone today was rummaging around near the Dead Sea and they entered a cave and found this pot with this book in it, which was called the Bible, they would be going through every single last letter and sentence in this book, trying to find real history.
Right.
But because the Bible has religious baggage attached to it, the Egyptologists and even the archaeologists from Israel won't really touch it.
Right.
It's almost taboo for them because it's religious. But it's not. It's a historical text. And it's a historical text that has come straight out of ancient history. Now, they try to deflect this by saying, oh, you know, these were just poor shepherds, and therefore it's a big oral tradition, and therefore a lot of the history would be garbled, you know, with Chinese whisper syndromes and all the rest of this business. But no, it wasn't. These were pharaohs. They would have had scribes. It would not have been an oral history. This was a written history that came from Abraham, who I say was Pharaoh Mam-Abra, and from Jacob, who I say was Pharaoh Jacob. And that's something they don't tell you about, that there was a Pharaoh from northern Egypt who was called Jacob, Jacobah. So in this new guise, it's no longer an oral history of a few Bedouin floating around with half a dozen starving sheep. We now have the Bible as being the day book. Within Egypt, within the royal court, and they probably still do the same now, I don't know, but the royal court in Egypt used to keep a day book, a diary. And this was a diary of the royal court. The trivia, the main events, everything that was going on within the royal court was recorded in the day book. So essentially what I'm saying is the Bible is the day book of the Hyksos pharaohs of Lower Egypt.
Which gives it a whole
other
level of importance.
Absolutely. And it also means that it is not an oral history, it was a written history. They would have had the scribes. And so it could well be an exact history of what happened in that era. So instead of being mythology, now we're saying it is 100% historical fact, if you can understand what it was saying. So, you know, these things we've been talking about before, you know, when we're talking about sheep and bulls, we're actually talking about Apis bull worship and sheep Aries worship.
Right.
The cult, hence the shepherd kings, of course. This is why they were called the shepherd kings, because Aries was the dominant constellation at that time. That's why they were called the shepherd kings.
Well, even the word Hyksos itself has two meanings.
It does, yes. A lot of people will say it doesn't mean shepherd king, but clearly Josephus and Manetho said it does mean shepherd king. And the giveaway there is that it's spelt with the shepherd's crook. And so we can see it has a connection with shepherds. In actual fact, the word is Hyksos, which tends to mean, well, Egyptologists will say that it means the kings of the foreign lands, but it doesn't. The literal translation is Hyksos, the kings of the mountains. But I've retranslated that because that really doesn't make much sense. That's why they say it's foreign, because there's no mountains in Egypt, and therefore anything to do with mountains has to be foreign. No, because this particular glyph is used in many things that are purely Egyptian, so it doesn't mean foreign. So what does kasut mean? What's these mountains? And of course, the big sacred mountains of Egypt are going about back again to King Solomon and the Star of David. The mountains, the sacred mountains of Egypt were the pyramids.
Right.
And so they were the Hyksos, they were the kings of the pyramids, the kings of Giza, the people who ruled over the most sacred monument within Egypt. The Giza pyramids, of course, were not tombs. We're not talking about tombs here. The pyramids, the ancient pyramids, the megalithic pyramids, have nothing to do with being tombs. They were cathedrals, perhaps, you know. That's a much better way of looking at them.
Some say observatories.
Observatories? Well, it had a huge, great observatory on the top of the Great Pyramid. So, yes. Egyptian religion had a great deal, in fact, its fundamental element was astronomy.
Right.
And so you would need an observatory, and that's
very sophisticated mathematical formulas, very exact alignments, yes.
As we know, yes, the pyramids are all based on mathematical formulae. They are representations of, you know, the belt of Orion and things of that nature. So, yes, they were observatories, they were the sacred mountains, and so the kings of the mountains, the Hyksos, the Hyksos, were the kings of the pyramids. These were the people who looked after the sacred mountains of Egypt. And while we're talking about this subject, we might as well come straight on to the sacred mountain of the Israelites, of course, because there we have another conundrum. We have these Israelites wandering around the Sinai Peninsula and having a sacred mountain which was some craggy rock in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. Balderdash, rubbish, nonsense, doesn't make any sense. The Israelites were the Hyksos Egyptians of Lower Egypt, and so their sacred mountain was the Great Pyramid of Giza. And so Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid. And okay, again, it's a huge jump in
I don't know
our
why, but I'm getting
conception.
chills as you're saying
Yes,
this.
but suddenly it starts to make sense. You know, here were the Israelites sitting in Egypt, because we know the Israelites went to Egypt, even as the Bible says, with Joseph going down into Egypt and Moses being in Egypt. So they were in Egypt for anything between 200 and 400 years. And yet nowhere in the Bible does it mention the pyramids of Giza. These were the most magnificent monuments in ancient times. In an era when most people lived in mud huts, you know, and you've got this monument that's 150 meters high. And these people live in Egypt for at least 200 or 400 years and never mention the pyramids. It's just not possible, is it? They did mention the pyramids, but they called them Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb. And if you look at the descriptions of Mount Sinai, especially if you include the descriptions from Josephus, all of those descriptions match the Great Pyramid of Giza. They say it was the highest mountain. Yes, it was. Great Pyramid is the highest. It was sharp, difficult to climb. Yes, it was. It was the biggest mountain, as we've said, but it was also small enough that you could cordon it off, because you weren't allowed to touch the mountain. So you could actually put a cordon around the bottom and stop people touching it. So it had to be actually quite small. It had a cave inside it. Now, a lot of people will say that Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai. He didn't. He went inside Mount Sinai. And the Quran is quite emphatic about this, that he went, or initiates went down inside the mountain holding on a rope.
Right.
So there was a cave inside it, just like there is in the Great Pyramid. And perhaps most convincingly of all, at the base of the pyramid, at the base of Mount Sinai, was a pavement, a basalt pavement that looked like the night sky, polished, gleaming like the night sky. So where would you find that in the Sinai Peninsula? Well, you can't. But of course, on the eastern face of the Great Pyramid, we have the great basalt pavement. And originally that would have been a huge black basalt pavement, which would have been polished and shone like the night sky. And so, yeah, the Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid of Giza.
You know, are you going to continue on that statement?
No, that's fine.
I was going to say, I think we're running up on our time limit, but that is so intriguing that I would like to say at this point, to have any of us that are intrigued with this, to take a look at your books. They're really pretty incredible works, and
Yes.
I would love to be able to just secret away for about 2 weeks with them and read every one of them, and I'll do the best I can.
Well, if I can say so myself, whether you agree with what I've written or whether you don't, the books are 100% original. So you won't find reprocessed information from other people's books.
Right.
These are new thoughts, new ways of looking at these problems. And there's an awful lot of information in those books. They are worth reading and then reading again, because every page has new facts. There's no padding. There's no extras. It's all new information.
Right. I see this. Well, to say they're thought-provoking is an understatement. So I think I can only recommend that. I've barely gotten into them myself. I'm very intrigued with what you're saying, and again, in the pursuit of knowledge, thank you for your offerings, and we're going to continue this conversation for part 2 on the life of Jesus. Thank you. Coming up soon, we'll be talking with Ralph about the life of Jesus. To say it's thought-provoking would be an understatement. If you're interested in alternative views of biblical history, you will also enjoy our interview with Acharya S. Until next time, thanks for watching.